This is a collaborative effort between the Center for Applied Research Solutions, Trauma Transformed, where I spend a lot of my time, and also working with the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. So, and we're across the country and funded by SAMHSA, which is such a gift and a blessing to be able to do this work. So I'm gonna introduce myself and I want to meet each and every one of you. So my name is Bree. Full name is Brianna, but that's only when I'm in trouble. So Bree is preferred. I use she, hers pronouns. And I got some of my socials on there if you are as addicted to your phones and social media as I am. But I'd love to just connect briefly here. So if we can, I'm going to do a little exercise because we're across the country. We have so many people. I want to do a little time zone shout out. So when I say your time zone, whoever lives in that time zone, whoever's in that space, feel free to come off mute in that moment and just do a little what or whoop whoop or make some fun noise to let us know who's in the house. So where are my Eastern time zone folks at? Come off mute, let us know where you at. Woo woo. Okay, we got a good crew. Okay. Where's now? Here's my test though. Am I going to miss a time zone? Where's my Central time zone folks at? My Midwesterners. Yes. Grew up in Wisconsin, so I see you. I see you. Okay. What about my, is it Mountain next? Yeah, my Mountain folks. Where y'all at? Woo woo. Okay, we got one. Carissa coming in strong. Okay, I love it. And where my Pacific Coasters? Where y'all at?
Hello.
Yes. Okay. Any time zones I missed? Because that'd be embarrassing. Okay. Good, we did it. Okay, welcome. Thank you for being in this space. Thank you for being in this space. Our next check-in, please. I'd love to know, how familiar are you with trauma-informed practices? And so this is great in the chat. Feel free to drop your name and your position, kind of the department you're in, where you're coming from. And then just a simple number. 1, be like, Bree, this is my first time having a trauma-informed conversation. This is my first time in this space. I'm glad to be here. A 3 being like, hey, I have some awareness, but like I'm looking to implement, I want to learn more. And then in the chat, a 5 would be, Bree, I could teach this, move over. Not really, but you know, you feel pretty confident in your abilities, as maybe even consider yourself an expert. So I'd love to know. Okay, some 3s, love this, love this. Great, okay. Welcome to some 1s. I love to see it. Okay, Heidi, I'm moving over. You're doing this. You just interrupt me whenever, friend. School-based trauma clinician. Okay, we got some good. Okay, this is exciting. Okay, I really appreciate that perspective. That is helpful for me as I go through, just knowing, hey, where I need to maybe linger a bit longer, where I can skip over a bit faster. So that's super helpful. And again, as I said at the beginning, I spent a lot of time in K-12 education, primarily teaching middle school students, young people, right? And that is really what drew me to the trauma-informed conversation, seeing the ways that systems were or were not working for my students, seeing the ways that they were impacted negatively, sometimes by things that felt so out of my control, and learning that it really was a blend of who I am as a person, how I show up, how I present myself to my students, but also, whoa, there's this bigger conversation we need to have about how we design and plan things to better serve our young people. And so before we get deeper into the learning for today, I want to engage us just in a moment of a collective breath, because I think so often we run, we go, we do. We're human doings. We're not human beings. And I want to just give us a moment to settle into our bodies, settle into this space as we begin this conversation together. So if you're comfortable, feel free to close your eyes. Or even just find somewhere that you can look. Maybe there's an object that feels familiar or comfortable to you in the space that you're in. And feel free to just let your eyes focus on that. For me, I'm going to watch my snoring dog who's just over off screen. And as you do, just begin to pay attention to the breath that's flowing in and out of your mouth or your nose. Don't try to change it, just notice it. And as you're breathing, I want you to think about the fact that every person on the Zoom call right now is also taking a breath with you. each person who's here in this space, while maybe the depth of their breath or the strength of it may be different, we are taking a breath together. And now holding focus on your own breath, remembering the shared breath of each person on this call. Expand awareness again to the people in the community around you as you're sitting, taking this breath. Thinking how each breath they take matches and meets each breath you take. And this is true for us now, and this is true in history. The people whose land we reside on, the people whose stories have stopped centuries ago, peoples whose stories persist to this day. May each breath remind us that we belong to each other. That the fact that air is flowing through our lungs unifies us, connects us, and that may each breath remind us the value of others and the connection we have with them. Take a few more breaths and just noticing any tension or tightness in your body. Feel free to move your neck, your shoulders, wherever that tension may live. And as you feel comfortable, open your eyes again. Move your body. If your camera's off, feel free to turn it back on if that's comfortable for you. And let's dig in. Thanks for doing that with me. Hold that breath each time you breathe. Let's remember, right? We belong to each other. We're connected to each other. Thank you so much. I feel like the first slide after the mindfulness moment is always the worst because it's like, oh, I'm focused and embodied, and now I have to engage my thinking brain again, but it's good. It's clear, that fresh breath of air. Really quickly, just our goals and our vision for today, our purpose, right? Really analyzing this idea of stress, trauma, and grief, and how all of those interweave both in systems and communities, and how that shapes the ways we see and respond to crisis. We're going to be explicit too today in naming sociocultural trauma. We'll talk about more about what that is and how those relationships, community and culture, support healing. We'll also dig into our school crisis recovery and renewal framework and really look at how those 4 R's can impact our leadership and our decision-making when it comes to responding to a crisis. And just uplifting Christine's question, yes, we have a recording going right now, and we'll be sending out slides and resources in a follow-up email in the next couple days. Great question. So really anchor slide, focus slide, right? And I think those of us who are in systems, I think we maybe know this inherently, but I think it's important to name that stress, trauma, grief, crisis, these things have a deep personal resounding impact on individuals, right? We see this anytime we're responding to any event. But what I hope you see as a common theme as we move through this conversation is that it isn't just an individual conversation, right? That not only does this happen with people and to people, but we see the ways that our responses as humans get baked into systems. We see the ways that systems themselves are often designed for maybe certain efficiencies without holding on to humanity of individuals. And as we move forward, you'll see this continual looping back to, yes, like this has meaning for you as an individual human in your practice day to day, but this also has implications for our larger system as a whole. And so real quickly, I know you all have, there's decent familiarity with trauma-informed systems and principles on this call already, which is great. But really looking at these 6 critical principles when it comes to digging into what it means to be a trauma-informed school, a trauma-informed system, have a trauma-informed approach. Right, we talk about social justice, this awareness of the ways that society historically has not worked for all people, and the desire to see that changed. We have to have that conversation as part of being trauma-informed, because our unjust system in many ways is causing lots of trauma, lots of harm. We know that collaboration, peer support, mutuality, right, being able to lean into each other, that collective breath that we took together matters as being trauma-informed. Talk about safety and stability, right? Having an awareness of what safety actually means for people, having a diverse and broad understanding of safety, and thinking about predictability, levelness in our system so we can be connected and aware of each other. Trustworthiness, transparency, effective communication, all bundled into that when we talk about a trauma-informed system. Having empowerment, giving people agency, autonomy over their experience, over decisions. Oftentimes when we're traumatized, right, we lose that sense of control. And so what does it look like for us as individuals in our practice and in our systems to give that back to people through choice? And then resilience, growth, and change, acknowledging that oftentimes our system itself, right, we demand that people are resilient instead of actually noticing ways in which people already bring resilience. And I think being able to learn from them and their own resilience and the ways that they have adapted is really powerful. When we talk about too, growth and change, there is a silver lining when we talk about this idea of, okay, there has been a crisis. And us as a system, we have an opportunity to actually do something differently now because of what we've learned from this heartbreaking and complex experience. And so high level overview of kind of these 6 principles, and these are going to be woven throughout and really undercut the rest of the conversation that we have today. And so I want to engage your brains a little bit, and I want to do this through an exercise. And so this is a very fun tool that I learned about from my colleague Leora. Some of you, I'm certain, know her. She loves these. So this is a exercise called a Venn diagram. And the goal of this is not, I think often when we do Venn diagrams, we're looking for the overlap. We're looking to define the things that these categories or topics have in common. And today I'm inviting you actually to do the opposite. So to kind of get us thinking about our own personal experiences, what this has looked like for us in our environments, we're going to do a Venn diagram. And so this idea is to recognize and reckon with contradictions in these conversations and intentionally leave the overlap blank so we can keep imagining and creating from that intersection without being so set on defining it right now. And so kind of 2 questions to help us think about this. When we think about this concept of being trauma-informed, thinking about safety and stability, advocating for social justice, giving people voice, agency, choice over their experiences. What feels really affirming or celebratory about these principles and this idea? And then the vent, the opposite side of that, but what feels impossible or dichotomous, like at odds in working towards implementing these practices. I'm going to share an example and then give some more directions. So this is from an exercise from the Venn Diagrams website, thinking with educators about conversations about racial equity and justice. And so we see the challenge in the dichotomy of this conversation. And so the first example on the left says individual teacher effort alone cannot remedy this. I can't do this by myself. But on the flip side, the vent, without individual effort, we can't do this either. It's that both and that makes this work so beautiful, but so messy and so hard. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you a minute of think time. And what I'll have you do is as you reflect on these questions here, let's go back. What feels celebratory for you or exciting about trauma-informed principles? And what feels impossible or dichotomous in working towards implementing them? So I'm going to give you a minute of think time. And then I'm going to share how to engage and share out what you're thinking in a moment. So as you think through your response, there's an invitation for 2 ways to share. One, in the chat. So in the chat, you're welcome to type in the one side of your Venn diagram and then do like a slash or a line or an and symbol, and then type the side that's contrasting or the difficult side. So you're welcome to do that in the chat. Type both with some type of divider in between, whether that's a slash, the vertical line, an asterisk, an and symbol, type a word. Or I'd love if someone wants to come off mute and talk through and share what they're thinking. That would be wonderful as well. We'll give about 2 or 3 minutes. I'd love to hear from 2 or 3 other people besides myself. Yes, so Molly, I'm just going to give voice to that. Thank you for sharing that in the chat. Yes, thanks team. Right, we have resources to utilize it in direct practice, but the system limits that ability for that change. Yes, thank you. Exciting to bring healing to students, but it feels impossible to get buy-in when the adults have their own trauma work to do. Yes, Kendra, thank you for naming that, right? Like I'm trying to help young people hold their stuff and I'm still dealing with my own stuff. Like that's hard, especially in the event of a large crisis event, right? Affirming we can work together and it can be a reality. Yes. Oh, but yes, that challenge, Rosa. Thank you for sharing that. Not all parts of the system. Maybe share that perspective. Like, I don't know about you, but this tension here, right? Like it's both exhausting. Like my body feels tired reading these things like, because I feel the weight of some of these conversations. But I'm also someone who, when I feel that motivates me that like, oh, this tension, and I want to lean into the affirmation and that celebration. But also we can't do that without naming these things that feel impossible and complex. Man, y'all are dropping some truth in the chat today. Oh my goodness. I'm going to pause talking too. Does anyone want to come off mute and expand or share with their voice?
I can share.
Thanks, Nancy.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm a school counselor in California. And I feel like after the pandemic, well, we're still in a pandemic. I know that's still accurate, but I feel like now everyone is talking about mental health and being trauma informed, and our whole district has had multiple like trainings. So teachers, staff, everyone from like front desk to, you know, tutors, everyone is informed. But at the end of the day, like that part is really exciting and awesome because now it's not just like school counselors who are talking about it. Like now we're speaking the same language. But there's still like that emphasis on like completing credits and how are you doing in school and are you coming and, you know, are you keeping up with your appointments? Like I work at an independent study charter school and you know, at the end of the day, that is still more important to our district. And so that's the hard part. Like, how do we get to that place where, I don't know, like, I feel like that's what's going to help us re-engage our students academically is when we really dive deep, but it's so hard. So I get it, but it's hard.
Yes, because you're seeing the need for the shifts and you see how the shift in language and understanding is happening, but it's not matriculated yet up to like, hey, we're still grading the same way. Like, we know that this isn't helpful, but we're not actually changing the thing yet. And that feels really, that tension is really heavy there. I feel that.
Yeah.
Thank you for naming that, Nancy. I appreciate that. Does anyone else want to add to that, weigh in?
Yeah, I'll share. I'm
Thanks,
working
Philip.
as a director of school counseling at a Christian school. It's a private school, and most of our kids come from urban inner city areas. So most will have experience of either somebody, you know, losing their life to gun violence, or somebody in their family being addicted, parental absence, and many different things of that nature. So we have a structured desire to have trauma-informed care and structure, but there's not actually been a system built into it. So I've literally on my first year here, and there are no systems in place. So those are the two realities that, you know, I'm in currently. But I just think it is like a really good thing to know that there are resources, and that it is a common conversation amongst all circles of people, spaces, looking to provide care, trauma-informed care. Because during the pandemic, it's like a lot of kids got set back almost 2 years during that entire phase. And so, you know, just developmentally, we just are up against a lot more now. And so I agree with the last statement that I'm glad it's just not counselors or guidance counselors, whoever having this conversation, but it's a common theme throughout school systems.
Yes. I appreciate you giving voice to that, Philip. And even like looking at the registration list for today, like the intersection of different departments and teams and positions like here on this call right now is really energizing to me, because it is, we're talking, but we're interested in doing. And I'm excited that there's so many people here who are wanting to dive into that and wanting to make that change happen. So sitting in gratitude to be here with all of you. And again, keep me in the loop too. Like I said, please keep using those like reactions and things. And if you're like, yeah, Bree, we get this, let's keep it moving. Like, yes, I want to make sure that I'm meeting the needs as we have this conversation, because you're doing the work that matters right now. I'm just grateful. So yeah, just holding these tensions, right? And just naming that is really important and really powerful for us to acknowledge. Jane, did you come off mute? I think I just noticed you came off mute. I'd love to hear your voice. Okay, maybe not. Maybe that was a false alarm. Thanks for being here, Jane. Appreciate it. Yeah, just holding these tensions and knowing like we will not unlock the answer to every tension that exists through one conversation or through one training, but knowing what's happening for you in your environment and thinking critically about that as we continue moving forward may help us define that middle, may give us some imagination, may give us an action, may give us an idea for this intersection to begin to take action in a different way. So briefly, we're having really conversations kind of about multiple things. And I think what happens, especially in education and, school-based conversations, we know we love our acronyms, our buzzwords, all of these things, right? Like SEL, everyone was talking about this, or equity is another big buzzword that means like 8 million things to 8 million different people, right? And so looking clearly and saying, okay, when we're talking about a crisis event, we're talking about COVID, we're talking about the way gun violence is impacting our young people, when we're talking about the death by suicide that happens in our schools on a stunningly regular basis, there is a lot that actually happens to us and within us in these events. And most often we see these three things showing up. And so they progress into each other, they overlap, they relate, but yet they are three distinct things. And so we see stress being this overwhelmed sense, this pressure, this tension, Some stress is really good. It helps us, it motivates us, it moves us forward. But oftentimes that stress becomes this overwhelming and eliminates some of our abilities to cope and focus in the way a regulated brain might. We talk about trauma. This is a deeper sense of a loss of control and helplessness that overcomes us when we go through a crisis or something complex. And when I talk about crises, there's multiple facets to this, right? Because we know that there are large-scale crises that happen directly impacting communities, right? When there is an instance of gun violence in a community, that has a direct and immediate impact on the safety of the students in that system, the teachers in that system. But just because you are not most proximal to that event doesn't mean that it's not impacting you as well, right? And I think about some of the things that we've witnessed in current events and how I, as an educator, have empathy and relate differently to the trauma that other educators are experiencing. And while that may not have happened directly to me, that is still traumatic for me. That still creates stress for me. That still harms me in my body because I have a connection to that. And so I think that's important for us to consider as well, that trauma isn't just mine in this moment. It is a collective experience many times as well. And then we talk about grief and this idea of loss. And I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into each of these quickly. I know we had a decent amount of knowledge and awareness on the call, so I want to move through this and get to some of the other work. So we talk about stress, really what is happening in our bodies, right? Biologically, our system, our parasympathetic nervous system is working, our body is regulating itself, our biology is responding to our environment. But then when something pops, we have something that triggers us, we have something that feels overwhelming, our body can begin to get dysregulated. You know, we start to sweat, our heart beats faster, our digestive system gets a little out of whack, and we pop down into our survival brain, and we're not engaging that prefrontal cortex thinking brain. And what happens, this happens for us when we're stressed. This happens for us when we're experiencing trauma. This happens for us when we're responding and navigating grief. And really what happens is, when we are stressed, there's two kind of responses that can happen for us. We either see this as a manageable challenge, something that is, I can do this, I can overcome this, right? And I think about that like a deadline. Man, I am the queen of procrastination. I asked Livia, who's not my colleague on the call with me, I was like sending her stuff like this morning for things. I'm like, oh yeah, here's the slide deck. Like, I'm so procrastinating, right? But I know that I have a lot of resources at my disposal. Right? I know that I have access to these things. And so the resources that I know that I have match the stressor, right? They match the level of stress that I have. And so I see this as a challenge, something I can manage, something I can overcome. But often what happens, especially in our communities and many of the young people we serve, right? Their perception of the resources, whether they're available or not, right? Because we know we have resources, even us in the system, right? I know I have access to trauma-informed resources, but like, are they easy to access? Are they culturally relevant? Are they accessible to all of my students? Are they accessible to me and families? If my perceived resources are lower and they don't match the threat level of that stressor, this now becomes something that isn't a manageable challenge. This now becomes something that overwhelms me, overwhelms my system. And when we continually have people living in that overwhelming threat space, this ongoing continual stressor, that can then funnel over into trauma. And that can become this ongoing, right, chronic stress really has that same impact on the body. And so we talk about this. This comes from Bessel van der Kolk. This is also recently popularized by Dr. Bruce Perry in his wonderful book that he wrote with Oprah Winfrey. But when we talk about trauma, we know this to be kind of three facets. It's an event, it's an experience, and there's an effect that comes after that. And so when we talk about the event, this is something that happens. This is the thing, right? And I know that this is big crises. We see this with the pandemic, gun violence, right? But there's even micro events, micro crises that happen in our school system with young people, a fight in the hallway, conflict at home, tension between two best friends, especially in middle school, boyfriend, girlfriend breaking up, right? Those are stressors. Those are events that happen. And while to us, that may not feel like a crisis, that may not actually be a crisis, to that young person in that moment, that event can feel like a huge danger, a huge extreme threat of harm. And that's going to still have an impact on them in a powerful way. And so when that event happens, there's an experience that happens, right? We see the fight, the flight, the freeze, also the fawn. I'll get into that a little bit more briefly here, but that sense of helplessness can come over us, and that can overwhelm the brain and body. And we know then the effect of that not only impacts my reasoning, my judgment, my decision-making processes, my language faculties. I can't talk and communicate when I'm feeling traumatized or overwhelmed in the same way. We see this in our young people, like, hey, talk to me, what's going on? They're like, I don't know, like, I can't, right? I'm physically overwhelmed. I need a minute to calm down. I need space. I'm feeling disintegrated. I'm feeling dysregulated. Over time, when that continually happens, we know, and I think Philip kind of alluded to this in a comment he made earlier, that this has lasting adverse effects. This impacts physically, right? This impacts us physically, mentally, and emotionally. And this intersects as well with grief, right? When we talk about grief, this sense of loss isn't just the death of a meaningful person. It is most often, right? But it can also be the loss of a ritual, a routine, a habit. Many of us experienced a lot of grief over the course of the pandemic and the shutdowns, right? We lost connection, we lost ritual, we lost habit. And I think naming that is really important and really helpful, because often we don't realize, oh, shoot, like that's actually what's happening for me. I'm mourning what I had. And sometimes even for positive life transitions, we experience a sense of loss, right? We experience grief. And so high level, right, overview of all of these things. If you get nothing else from this conversation, like this is such a critical reflection of when we're in these systems, when we're in these conversations, right, really shifting that focus from what's wrong with that young person, what's wrong with me, what's wrong with this system, to really begin to be interrogative about what's happening here. What is happening for that young person? Is that young person experiencing a sense of loss and grief? How can I help them feel connected? Is that behavior? What is that behavior communicating? Is that communicating that they're overwhelmed? Oh, I think I can slow it down, give them a minute to refocus, do some breathing with them before I try to have this conversation. Or maybe is there a need that's yet unmet? Like, is this child perpetually like navigating hunger? Are they perpetually navigating tension in the home? What need is being unmet that will change my perspective on how I respond to that child? And most often, this is an interrupter to our thought processes, right? This is about interrupting my own response to things, or the system's response to things, of saying, hey, like instead of saying, what's wrong with this group of students? They keep getting written up. Why do we see this showing up in our data? We say, oh no, what's happening in our system and in our community that is leading to an increase of these students being documented or referred to services or documented behaviors? What's happening? What is this communicating? How do we address the needs underlying this so that we can rethink our system more creatively to better serve these young people? Okay, so I'm going to have us have a conversation about this content here in just a minute, but I want to reframe some of the fight, flight, freeze conversations and give me an emoji reaction. Have you seen this language before? I hope you have. I'm assuming those of you, especially those of you who've done trainings in the past, have heard of this fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, or maybe appease before. Yes, drop some emojis. Perfect. Love it. Great, 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 great. So I want to reframe some of these things a little bit for us, because oftentimes we think about this in terms of brain science and like what's happening, like, oh, fight. But like, I think sometimes we neglect to realize like how we actually label that differently in the school system, right? And what we see happening with our young people is these traumatized, highly stressed, deep in grief responses that are biologically happening for our kids. Like, they're not broken. This is what our bodies are trained to do to keep us safe. We label them differently in systems. We affirm or disaffirm different types of responses. and we make assumptions about what's going on for that child and, you know, what's wrong with them, why are they acting this way, instead of being like, oh, something's actually probably happening for them, and how their brain is responding is manifesting in a behavior that's actually very logical to them and feels like they're reestablishing safety. And so when we talk about each of these, and I'm not going to read them all because we all can read, but when we talk about each of these, the fight, oftentimes that's going to show up as a non-compliant student in the school system. And I remember looking at referral data as a teacher and seeing all of the like, oh, non-compliant, disrespect, defiance, non-compliant, defiance. And I'm like, what does that actually mean? We're writing all these kids up for that. What does that actually mean? And I think what we're missing to see is that child is pushing away because that feels safer, right? They're making themselves bigger. They're swelling up like the tiny little lizard does when he's trying to scare away the bird who's trying to eat him, right? Like that's what's happening for our kids. That flight response, right? That distracting could look like obsessing over performance, obsessing over grades. Like I think about myself as a student, I was going through a lot of really complex trauma when I was in middle school. And you never would have known because my grades, they were perfect, straight A's. If I had any like slight mark off, I was panicking up to my teacher, like blah, 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 blah. But that was my trauma response because I had so much chaos over here that I wanted that control over my grades. And so I was flighting, I was running away from my pain by being an overachiever. And I was celebrated for that. Instead of people being like, Bree, why are you putting so much like hope into this? Why is this your whole identity right now? Oh, everything else is hard. Let's talk about that, right? We see freeze too, just the numbness, the disconnection, right? They may be labeled as a disengaged students. Shifting, what is happening for that student? Why is that happening? And the fawn response or the appease, this is a bit newer in research. This one has to do more with caving into peer pressure. Like I'm going to just acquiesce. I'm going to let it happen because you know what, that's safer. That's safer. Yeah. Oh my gosh, of course. Like this really stresses me out, but I'm going to do it anyway because, oh yeah, that's going to just make this stressor go away faster. Someone who fears saying no, is hyper aware of what others have going on, and will be big into caving into peer pressure or following anyone's asks. So again, reframing those a little bit for how they might be mislabeled in schools. I want to give us an opportunity to chat about this. And so as you're reflecting, I think what I might do right now, I might send us into breakout rooms because that'll just make our conversations, we can have conversations a little bit more intentionally when we have. And what I want to do while we're in these is and I'll put these questions in the chat for us, but I want us to just engage in a quick conversation. When we think about this fight, flight, freeze, fawn, we think about this in terms of crisis. We think about this in terms of what's happening for our students. Which of these feel familiar? Which of these have you seen? Which of these fits with you? Which of these fits with your students? However you feel comfortable answering that. And then thinking about a crisis or thinking about ways in which the system responds to this, like what did you see, hear, feel under each F? And which one of these maybe is or is not affirmed in school systems? So I know there's like 10 billion questions and I'm going to give you like 6 minutes in breakout rooms. It's not going to be long enough at all. But just have a conversation about these 4 Fs and how you see them showing up both in crisis and then in just with the young people that you serve. So before I send you into rooms, what questions can I answer? Okay, I'm gonna give you about 6 minutes then in those breakout rooms, have a quick conversation. So what I want to be like extremely explicit about and name for all of us is the complexity of stress, trauma, grief, and how it occurs in the context of other oppressions. And this stuff doesn't happen in a vacuum. This happens in the real world that we live in. And when we notice these things, we see things like racism in and of itself is trauma. Right? Microaggressions, everything that comes with that, that is trauma. Xenophobia creates trauma. Homophobia creates trauma. Ableism, sexism, classism, right? All those isms that in and of themselves those create and induce stress, those create and induce trauma and are traumatic to live through. But even more than that, other traumas our young people experience occur within that context and within that framework as well, right? And so perhaps like when I'm looking at a wider, right, having conversations about a student death by suicide, that's occurring in the context of homophobia, that's occurring in the context of racism, and that impact compounds. And I think it's really important that we're very explicit about that when we're having trauma-informed conversations, because these things aren't adjacent, right? They're overlapping, they're intersecting. And when we see these ideas and these concepts, we often, I think, because it's easier for a system to have one conversation, right? It's easier for a system to focus on one thing at a time versus actually, hey, there's a holistic piece of this that we need to look at and see. Janine, did you want to add to this?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting out the car and I hit when you talk, I muted myself by accident. No, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. I was like, we're about to get some more wisdom. Let's go. Okay. No worries. Yeah, so just really drawing attention and really naming to this point of these individual things are trauma, but also trauma occurs within those things. And that impacts kind of like that visual we saw earlier about the stress, the manageable challenge versus an overwhelming threat. When students are living in a world that is racist, homophobic, sexist, xenophobic, the resources then that become available to communities, the resources that feel available, the supports that feel available continue to be reduced and continue to be diminished. And students, instead of feeling like they can come to school or come to, our clinics or come to the systems for help and support, now continue to see them as part of the problem because they have been and because they are, right? And I think, again, I'm guilty of this. We're all guilty of this. And I think it's important for us to not sit in a place of blame. This isn't about shame. This isn't about guilt, but it's really important for us to acknowledge, like, when I'm looking at these different intersectionalities, right? Like certain pieces of this matter to me differently. Certain pieces of my identity come to the surface in different spaces. And if I'm not thoughtful about acknowledging the ways that those things show up for me and how they impact my lens on the world, I will inadvertently or intentionally cause harm. And so I think acknowledging I have biases, right? Each and every single human on the planet has biases towards or against certain things. It's important for us to be aware of those things so that when we connect and interact and begin making decisions for our young people, that we can do them in a way that's actually mitigating those biases and putting our lens more clearly on who those individuals are, what their needs are, and not just what we perceive their needs to be through our biased lens. And that builds upon the conversation that y'all just had in your breakout rooms, but really making it explicit on the what is happening piece as it relates to some of those sociocultural traumas. And so, as we talked about earlier as well, some of these traumas and responses are socially validated while others are not. And I want to send you back briefly into breakout rooms to engage around these few questions, specifically thinking about the systems that you are in, the spaces where you work. And I'm going to give you a little bit more time in them this time to talk. Who's hurt, right? When we talk about people's trauma responses has mattered most. And then what evidence supports that response? So think about suspension data, referrals to your services, types of behaviors that are documented, right? What's showing up. And I want you to be really self-reflective in this space as well. When you think about fight, flight, freeze, fawn, when you think about specific behaviors that manifest out of those things, which experiences for you draw up greater empathy and which experiences are more challenging for you to understand? And then how does that compel you differently? What is coming up for you as you're thinking about implementing some trauma-informed practices, things like that in your system? And I'm going to send us back into breakout rooms, and I'll give you about 10 minutes this time to actually have a deeper conversation about this. Yep, and if you're not able to come off mute, that is okay. Welcome back. That conversation was able to be a build upon was able to be a continuation of maybe some of the thoughts that you started in the first breakout, some thoughts that came up from earlier parts of the session. And what I really want to do is begin stitching next. I want to draw us kind of back together and thinking about, okay, now then I've got, yes, okay, Bree, I'm processing stress, trauma, grief. I see the problem, like I understand these issues, I feel them, I live them. So then when we talk about this school crisis recovery and renewal framework, how does this begin to intersect and how do these things start to overlap? And so we talk a lot about the 4 R's. And each of these have to do with our response to a crisis event. And as I hinted at before, we talk largely about crises as these big scale events that are happening. You know, pandemic was a huge one. We talk about gun violence in our communities. But I also really, again, want to uplift this idea that our students are also living through micro crises. And if you think about the things that were a big deal to you when you were 9, when you were 14, when you were 17, and how those things had such a massive impact on your mental health, on your well-being, on your ability to think and make decisions, those things in many ways are like micro crises happening for our students. And so while we talk about large scale system response to collective crises that we see large scale in a community, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that some of our students may feel some of these things in a smaller scale on their day-to-day life. I think that's really important to hold our young people that way. And this is not a linear process either. This is really they merge together, they overlap, they intersect. And I'm going to go kind of a quick overview of the first 2, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into actually recovery and renewal and what those things actually mean. And so the first 2, the readiness and response, these are things that most systems already have a decent handle on, give or take, right? When we talk about readiness, like my dog barking at the mailman. We talk about readiness, right? This is an ongoing process that's happening in our systems. So this is when we do trainings, when we try to build capacity with staff, when we have communication systems, family engagement, how are we keeping our people and our systems engaged before a big thing happens? Then the big thing happens. There's a crisis, there's an event, there's something like that happens. Immediately after we enter the response phase. And this is truly about getting into the stabilization. This is about attending to like the immediate safety after thinking about the wildfires that have happened throughout California, where locating people, building emergency shelters, getting resources, communication, like messaging, all of that immediate response, that's what happens. And oftentimes agencies stop there. We have a lot of places that'll come in and bring food and fundraisers and donations and things to respond to help the needs of the crisis. And then oftentimes, you know, in the months or weeks later, those things vanish, those things disappear. They're not as available anymore, but there are still things happening for members of the community. And that's what I want to dig into today with the recovery and renewal. Now, recovery and renewal really is about beginning to orient ourselves to our new reality, how what has happened to us has impacted us, how it's shaped our systems, shaped us as individuals. And individually and collectively, when we begin to exit the response phase, we begin to move towards meaning making. Our critical thinking brains are getting engaged again. A few questions can help us distinguish if us as individuals or as a system are actually entering kind of that next step. And so asking ourselves, like, how activated are our nervous systems? Like, do our bodies still feel like we are in crisis? We may still then just be responding. We may still be immediately restabilizing and may not be ready to actually start making meaning yet. Are we attending to immediate safety needs? Are we able to do any reflecting? How safe do we feel? How connected do we feel to those around us? How easy or challenging is it for us to trust others? What kind of story are we telling ourselves about others and what has happened? And if we're able to start kind of answering some of those questions like affirmatively, we're beginning to feel a bit safer, we're beginning to feel a bit physically de-escalated, we may then begin to enter this kind of recovery and renewal phase. And Vicky dropped a really cool resource in the chat there, a free network of support for LA County. So if that's relevant to your location, dig into that. And again, if any of you have resources that feel relevant, I know there's been a few dropped, we'll make a point to pull those out and kind of build like a little resource bibliography from this training. So when we talk about recovery, we're moving away from this immediate response, which we kind of see beginning to intersect with step one. We're establishing that safety and that stabilization, plug to the trauma-informed principle language mentioned earlier, right? Then we move into beginning to remember and mourn and start telling the story, right? We're allowing ourselves to enter into maybe some grief, letting that happen, creating a sense of community around that mourning process. And then we enter step three, this reconnection with life and beginning to engage in social action, which begins to bridge us into the renewal phase. And again, these are going to overlap, these are going to intersect, these are going to mush up together, because as we know, moving towards healing, especially after a big crisis event, is unique to each individual. It's complex and it's messy, and our system doesn't do well with that. Oftentimes we as people don't do well with that. We want things linear, clear, concrete, and that's not, unfortunately, the way this goes, right? And so we talk about safety, having conversations about what this actually means for communities is super important. And so when we talk about physical safety, right, that's, yes, a literal protection from harm, but that also looks like clear safety procedures, processes for things that are followed consistently, a reduction of unnecessary triggers, being conscious of things that might be alarming to students, right, like things like loud noises, certain scents, certain lighting, being intentional about building a space that feels physically safe. We talk also about emotional safety. This comes powerfully through relationships as well, but it's also about equipping our young people with language to talk about these things. I'll put in the resource email, there's a wonderful, or the follow-up email, there's a wonderful resource I love from researcher out of Yale, Mark Brackett. And he has what he calls a mood meter, and it has beautiful feeling language. And I loved using that with my 8th graders, not only as a vocabulary exercise to teach them like, hey, this is a cool new vocab word for you, but also it gave them tools to say, like, instead of just being mad, like, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling desensitized, I'm, just giving them language to talk about that, because when they can better articulate, we can better create a physical and socially safe environment for them to help them feel safe. Social safety as well, relationships, being aware, like just believing kids, right? If they're saying something stressful, something's overwhelming, who do we question first? What does that look like for us to say, ooh, tell me more about this. I believe you, I trust you, I'm a safe adult for you. And as much as this feels stressful too, predictability is really helpful in routines, consistency, having information clearly posted, clearly accessible, having plenty of transition time and supports if there's going to be a change, giving lots or as much heads up as possible so students know what to predict in each of these environments. And again, when we define these things, right, when we talk about clear safety procedures, we talk about what is triggering for individuals in the physical safety. When we talk about routines, who is defining that? This links back to the conversation that you had in your breakout rooms previously. This links back to our conversation about trauma occurring in the context of other oppressions. If we're not including a rich variety of voices in the conversation, we're letting people who have historically caused harm continue to cause harm by defining safety for all communities. So it's really important that as we're responding to crisis, we're building trauma-informed systems. Who is at the table? Who is part of defining what safety looks like? Because if we're not intentional about that, it's going to continue to replicate some of the same harms that have happened before. And we talk about this through just different visual here, this idea of stabilization, right? Helping students be regulated within themselves, but also helping us as adults be regulated within ourselves, right? Teaching explicitly coping mechanisms, strategies, engaging students in breathing exercises like we did in the beginning, having movement activities, letting them have communication with each other and just like, oh, I feel energy. Okay, let me respond to that. You're not feeling safe in your own body right now because you've got so much energy in there. Okay, let's do some movements. You can release that. What does it look like to help our students regain a sense of power and control? When can we give choice in our systems? Even simple academic choices can be a really powerful way to help our students feel more stabilized after a crisis. Oh, do you want to read in your desk, sitting in your chair, or do you want to read under your desk? That's a simple, silly choice, but it can be really impactful. helping students learn to metabolize their emotions. My counselors on here, I think you do this so well and so naturally in your work, right? Like getting kids, letting them vent, letting them throw a sticky ball against the wall, something to help them metabolize what they're feeling and talk about it, even if they don't have words necessarily. Self-awareness, that sense of beloved community, knowing and being known. All of these pieces. Yes, the Atlas of the Heart book, Michelle, that's such a great resource. Yeah, thinking about how we're truly becoming self-aware. Like a big strategy I love with my students for that stabilization for them is just called noticing and naming. Like when a student is beginning to like, hey, like, bud, I notice your leg is really bouncing. Like that's telling that indicates to me that you might be feeling really stressed out. Is that true? What can we do? What do you need right now? Just seriously, it's about paying attention to what's happening, helping students then become aware of that's happening for them. Like when you feel angry, what does that feel like inside you, right? All of those things can be really powerful to allowing them to become aware. So that way, when they notice it, they can regain a sense of control over that, make a different choice with support from an adult that can move them towards meaning making and not just spiraling in this stress and sense of overwhelm. Second step of this, this recovery spot is really thinking about, okay, how are we allowing students? We talked about, right, that attunement, self-awareness, creating spaces to process. So how are we doing this then in a collective way that's honoring the shared experience we have? So this looks like literally just holding space. Community circles, circle conversations are a great methodology for this, but just allowing the space to let people be. I'm not going to problem solve. I'm not going to fix anything. What's happening for you right now? Tell me about that. And letting that be there, right? Telling stories, sharing memories, especially if this is after a loss, creating space to laugh and remember that individual can be really powerful. Validating the emotions young people feel. Yeah, it makes sense that you're angry. That, yes, thank you for sharing that with me. Co-regulation, right? Getting down on their level, breathing with them, breathing next to them, allowing yourself to cry in front of them, allowing yourself to show those emotions to them and how you're responding and you're relating to them. It's also super important too, if there is in a crisis event, when there's loss, those closest impacted, right? I said earlier, like this impacts a wider amount of people, right? Even if I wasn't physically at the crisis event, I might still be impacted by it. Thinking about though, those who are closest to it, how do we create specific spaces for them to remember and mourn and share what's happening for them? Because really, as we know, just like in the classroom, students have differentiated academic needs. They'll also need different things to mourn. So creating different spaces for young people and within the system can be really powerful. And then kind of the final step of this phase, and this begins to transition us into the renewal, is this idea of reconnection. So we've remembered, we've mourned, we've allowed ourselves space to feel, to emote, to process. Leaning into that trauma-informed principle again of collaboration and empowerment, having that voice and choice and agency. How do we come together and how do we begin to take action, to take ownership instead of just lingering in the grief, lingering in the trauma and stress? And this shows up in kind of two different ways. This shows up in an individual lens of students beginning to like reinvent themselves, find new possibility, opportunity, realizing strengths that they have and pointing those out for our young people. Like, wow, like this was so hard, but I noticed you were always checking in on your classmates. That's really amazing. Establishing goals, they may have a new plan of action, like they may pivot majors, they may decide to go a different path with their life because of an experience they've had. And this may show up collectively. Social action, community justice, begin organizing because our young people have a very powerful voice as well. So I don't want to pause right here because again, as I said at the beginning, I'm dumping so much information your direction. A few points of consideration, and then also just creating space if you have any questions at this point, things you're wondering, things you want to ask. We're going to stay together as a whole group for this one. Feel free to come off mute or in the chat, answer any of these questions. What does safety and stability look like in your systems? What does that look like for you? When we think about different domains of safety, physical, emotional, social, predictability, which one's least attended to and why? How have you seen each of these steps play out in your system? What's coming up for you when you think about these 3 steps? or if there's any questions you want to ask or any other insights you want to share. I'm going to create 3 to 5 minutes for us to just chat briefly as a whole group about this chunk of the training. It's the perks of being a teacher before being a facilitator is I've got great wait time. I can wait a long time. Please feel free in the chat or in the chat or coming off mute. And I see Janine's out of the car. Welcome home.
Thank you. I was trying to grab a bite to eat, which is why I have my camera off. Excuse me. I think reflecting on creating safety and stability, I think the first thing is just, for me, just trying to be aware of what's going on for me. So like when I hear something, just kind of like doing like a really quick scan and checking in with myself and grounding myself before I even begin to go and do anything. So creating safety and stability for me starts with myself.
Yes.
Taking that pause, even if, something, and just kind of checking in. And if something, if it's in the middle of, people fighting, even in that, just trying to, just checking on myself. I worked in law enforcement in my former life, so one of the benefits of that was being able to kind of have some space between what's happening and myself.
Yes.
In terms of which domain I think of safety is least attended to, I think in school settings especially, I would say 1 and 2. I think people jump right to 3. Once they separate students, we automatically kind of go right to 3. That's a generalization.
Sure.
But that's just what I wanted to offer.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I think, a lot's resonating with me for what you're saying, but I think we see so often, just in that system, there's like one thing, we can focus on one thing, and then we lose sight of like, no, there's so much more that has to intersect and overlap. And Jen, it looked like you came off mute. I'd love to hear your voice.
I did, but then I muted because I thought my air conditioner might be too loud. It's really muggy here today. I didn't have anything I wanted to add for the first part, but for me, I noticed that I think that a domain of safety that's least attended to is predictability. I think it's often overlooked. Students have schedules, but I think like the awareness that not all students have a predictable home life is often like overlooked. And I think just as educators, just remembering that, because in like where we live in our county, we have a lot of families in transition and a lot of youth in transition. And it's really hard to, be present and attend to everything you're supposed to do in school when you don't know where you're sleeping that night.
Yeah. And affirming 100%. And I think even more than that, we have like in education, like our Pinterest classroom and our like teachers pay teachers classroom where we're like, I need something fun. I don't want to do the same rituals every day. I need to be like engaging and exciting and all these things, which is true. We need to engage our babies. But if we're not actually thinking about, wow, when they come into my classroom, do they know what's going to happen every day? Are they like, or is it just a big mystery and they have no sense of predictability, no sense of like, okay, I know that this classroom, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. And even if the content's different, even if the activity is different, I know there's a ritual here. I know that Miss Young has established these things. It's good, it's safe. And I think that predictability is super helpful and super critical. Absolutely, I agree. Space for one more voice if anyone else wants to weigh in. Sweet. All right, I'll keep us moving. So from that kind of final step of safety, we see this idea of reconnection with life, right? We've kind of moved a little bit further past. This is probably weeks after this crisis event has happened. So what we see here is this idea of renewal, which is really that movement collectively and individually towards meaning making, telling a shared story, actually beginning to feel like we are healing and reintegrating again, but then also beginning to make change. And this is the leverage point that I think is often missed when we talk about responding to crisis events, both smaller scale in schools and larger scale in society is, okay, we see all the ways. I think about this like so vividly after COVID and when schools began reopening again. We had such an opportunity to do things differently, to rethink systems, because, you know, we don't have young people in our buildings right now. What can we do? What can we do? And largely that initiative, there were so many conversations happening, but a lot of it just fizzled out. And so what we see here is really the goal of renewing, making things new, making things right. What we see is just kind of these different elements of this, and I'm going to hone in on just a few of them during our conversation, but structural witnessing, collectively telling a story, thinking about what a healing-centered culture is actually going to look like. How do we redesign our schools, our foster care system, all of these things, right? Which is, I know, obviously a big thing. So brief conversation about this idea of resilience. Because I think often we see this as something we expect of students and we like, well, you just need to be resilient. And it's like, or can we stop making things that make them have to be resilient? And can we actually like establish, I don't know, something that's stable, safe, predictable? And also let's not neglect the resilience that our communities show. I'm thinking about Jen even sharing like the families in transition that she sees in her space on a regular basis. Like, there is already so much resilience that's happening there. Like, I don't have to teach really my babies to be resilient. Like, so many of our students already do this. So how are we honoring and validating what's happening in those communities already? And so I think when we look at the APA definition, we see adapting well in the face of adversity, right? Being able to adapt, adjust, pivot as individuals. But as we progress and as we get a little bit more deeper and a little bit more community driven, I want us to think about this, that that second definition, resilience is both the capacity of individuals, but also the collective capacity to negotiate for resources that can be provided in culturally meaningful ways, beginning to shift that focus. And then even this third definition builds upon that even more so of community resilience, right? This ability of a community to adapt to and even thrive in the face of adversity. And we see this coming together after a big crisis. We see the ways that people support each other, mutual aid, care. So when we know that these are principles of effective resilience, why is that not part of our general conversation? And I think, again, Philip said this earlier too, like, bringing in families, having conversations with the community as a whole as we move towards these things is really powerful. And that pushes us, all of these things kind of bring us to this idea of healing. And again, this isn't something that's looking the same for everybody, right? This isn't something that everybody is sitting in on and is going to be identical for each individual, which is harder for our systems to respond to because we want this cookie cutter pathway to follow that doesn't always exist. So when we make things predictable, we have to also keep them adaptable and engage in some reflecting around kind of these four components of healing. So when we look at renewal, we look at making meaning and making change happen after a crisis event, macro or micro. There's kind of four categories that help us do this. And then a series of questions that help us kind of distinguish and reflect on what might help us do this effectively. So the root cause focus, what are some of the underlying things that are happening that impacted the crisis, right? This loops back to our fight, flight, freeze. This loops back to sociocultural trauma, right? Where is there need for a deeper reflection on what's really happening? And again, that's like I said at the beginning, this is the question. This is the framing we need. It's not what's wrong with these people. It's what's happening in this community, what's happening because of this crisis. That's what we need to really dig into in that root cause focus, analyzing, okay, what was going on underneath all of these things? What other issues existed is a really powerful starting point when we begin to move towards healing after a crisis. and making a new and better way. Meaning making. Who's telling the story? How are we collectively speaking about this experience? When we talk about COVID, right, beyond just a journal prompt, right, at like an icebreaker journal prompt at the start of class, how are we allowing our young people to actually tell what happened to them over the course of the last couple of years? In what ways are their voices being brought into the conversation, or maybe even leading the conversation? What outcomes do we see from the stories being told? What narratives are beginning to shape? And I think we see this with different education policy and different approaches happening in different states that, oh no, these are the stories that have value. These are the stories that get to speak the loudest. Why? Why are those the ones being uplifted? And how do we then kind of level out the voices and make sure that there is an equity of voice that's actually happening there? And keep in mind, equity of voice does not mean equality of voice. Restoration and identity shifts, our young people are beginning to, as they're making meaning, right, as they're beginning to process what has happened, beginning to tell that story, as we as the system begin to process and tell that story, there's going to be some things that happen to us, right? We are going to either perhaps, okay, like I am now coming back to who I was after the crisis. I'm beginning to like feel more like myself again. I'm beginning to, you know, reconnect with the things I loved before. But I may also have some shifts in identity. I may change. I may be different now because of this thing, right? Like I think many of us have probably had instances where like we're going out in public and we realize we don't have like our masks, and that physical panic of like, oh, my mask, right? Like we've shifted, right? How I feel, how my face feels when I'm out in public now feels different because I'm so, right, we're conditioned to wearing this. And that's a sillier example, but it is this idea of what is changing within us, what is shifting, and are we allowing our young people the opportunity to make those shifts? Who are you? How are you defining yourself? What does that look like? And I think too, then again, individually, but then also collectively, as an institution, right, we are going to see both restoration happen and we're going to see identity shifts happen. And most often people want to live in the restoration, right? Most often we just want to get back to normal. We want to get back to the way things were. It's not always helpful. It's not always just. It's not always right. And so again, asking ourselves these questions of what does it look like to move forward without moving on? We're not forgetting, we're not moving on. But how then do we redefine ourselves and our organizations? What did we learn from this crisis event that points to larger change that needs to happen? And then that last piece of this, what do we need to repair or fix? And I think this is really hard. This is really hard because this requires a system to admit, hey, I haven't done right by everyone. And that then in turn means I have to do something about it. And the doing something about it is where I think we often get stuck. So where might harm have been caused during the response and during the recovery? Whose safety might I not have honored? Whose voice might I not have listened to? And how do we make that right? How do individuals define healing? And how do we create a collective acknowledgement or affirmation of that healing, right? I think about Kendrick Lamar's new album, which is still blowing my mind, but that's a different conversation. But he talked like one of his opening song, right? There's a line, I grieve different. And I think about that line a lot when I'm doing workshops like this, because each individual is going to grieve different. Each individual is going to experience healing, restoration, meaning making differently. And so then as a system, what ways can we create a collective acknowledgement or affirmation of that? Can create different spaces in our classrooms or institutions for students to live through these things and try them out differently. I don't know. We have to consider that. Again, this is just kind of emphasizing this point of when we talk about meaning making, we talk about restoration. So I'm going to give you a minute. Just take a look at these quotes and feel free to just drop in the chat. When you think about meaning making, which of these is resonating for you? It's relative, it's personal, takes time. You don't have to understand it. Even when you do find meaning, you won't feel it was worth the cost of what you lost. Right? Our loss, our trauma, our crisis is not a test, a lesson, something to handle. It's not a gift. It's not a blessing. It just happened. Only you can find your own meaning. And meaningful connections heal painful memories. Just an invitation to reflect on that and think through which of these resonates to you the most. And just continuing that reflective mindset. Yeah, your loss is not a test. I think we use that language a lot, don't we? So then moving us even deeper into conversation, right? As we think about that root cause focus, think about that meaning making, identity shifts and repair. Which of these elements is feeling the most resonant for you right now and why? And I had those meaning making quotes there on the screen. The looping back to this idea of, oops, my slide deck, here we go. Which of these is feeling the most resonant for you when you think about crises that your system has walked through? Maybe this is gaps as you guys are moving away from like, okay, we're just immediately responding to needs, but now we're reestablishing, we're making meaning, we're beginning to think about what healing might look like. Which of these feels maybe the most important to you, is resonating with you the most right now, and why? Feel free to drop that in the chat, or feel free to come off mute because I would love to hear your voices. Okay, repairing is coming up for some. Root cause. I love this. And this is what typically happens, right? We have each one of these hits people differently, right? And so this idea of, okay, each system, each individual is experiencing all of these things differently. And it has different needs, right? And I think that's just such a clear example of this with what's happening in the chat. Yes, that who am I question. So what does it look like to give kids space to process that question, ask that question of themselves, have adult support and care as they're beginning to answer that for themselves, right? I'd be curious too if anyone's willing to come off mute and just expand a little bit, share a little bit more about what's coming up for them as they think about the doing of this. Okay, no worries. I appreciate the chat engagement. So here comes the conversation then of, okay, so now what? Great. There's a lot of information, a lot of things to process, consider, and explore. And so I want to invite us into a little bit of reflection when we think about how this can show up for us in our systems. And again, the classroom and school may not align perfectly with your context. So feel free to edit those top labels that make sense to you from personally yourself, you as an individual, when you think about your crisis response. We think about maybe a bit scaling up a little bit smaller of a community, widening the lens a little bit. So that might be a classroom, that might be your direct team or your department. And then we think about the school, widening that lens even further to maybe your whole building, your whole staff, whatever that may look like. Piecing together elements of the conversation that we've had today, thinking about, oh, wow, this was a light bulb moment for me. This was a new reflection point for me. I'm inviting you around those domains to begin reflecting in 3 different ways. When I think about my response to crisis, when I think about moving my young people towards healing, what is something that is worth stopping for myself, the classroom and school, a habit and a practice, a mindset and approach that I need to stop doing in order to move people towards healing and renewal? What is something we're already doing? What is something that's happening across myself, the classroom and school, that's worth sustaining and maintaining to help my young people move towards healing? And what's an idea or something new that is sparking for me right now that I want to bring into the conversation? And so here's a sample of kind of what this might look like. What is something I want to stop, sustain, and start for myself, my classroom, and my school? And I think Livia will drop the link to that in the chat. Otherwise, I will grab it and do that. I might do that as we're beginning to reflect on this tool and on this conversation we just had. What does that actually look like? So as I'm verbally stalling, let's see, this may not let you, so we'll see. If that one doesn't work, try this link. Perfect. So that's just a tool that you can access to kind of engage in this reflective process. And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn off my camera and grab my dogs because they are barking at our gardener who just got here. So I'm going to do that. Go ahead and pull up the link to this and begin thinking through, okay, what am I personally and collectively going to stop, start, and sustain to make a difference in terms of moving towards healing for young people? The amount of times these cute dogs love to interrupt. Let me know if you're having a hard time accessing that link. And this isn't something that you're going to finish right now necessarily. It's just something to take space and do some reflecting on of like, okay, what's impacting, what's landing for me individually as I think personally about what I want to stop, what I want to sustain doing, and what I want to start. And then the same thing for my larger system as a whole, because again, this has to be, yes, that Venn diagram, right? This has to be individual, but it also has to be collective. It has to be systemic. And so briefly what I'm going to do, because listen, if I can get you out of here a couple minutes early, let's do that. Because let's be real, we're all busy and have a lot going on. There's so many tools and opportunities as well to continue engaging with the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project. If you are specifically navigating things that feel overwhelming, that feel too much, that feel like I don't have the support or the resources I have, or I need some like greater support analyzing those resources, there's two different ways that you can connect with SCR besides just the trainings. But the biggest one is actually taking technical assistance requests. So this can actually be something you submit. There'll be a link in my follow-up email that a bunch of my colleagues are like available and ready to just sit and meet with you. Partnership through workshops, resource creation, just consultations, conversations to help really navigate what does this look like in your system and in your space. Also too, for my school resource folks, there's the School Mental Health Crisis Leadership Lessons free resource that'll be linked for you in the follow-up email with the email you provided in the registration. And then there's a few other workshops that are coming up with the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal Project, and Livia's putting those links in the chat. And we just encourage you to visit the School Crisis Recovery and Renewal website because there's a lot of information on there, upcoming events, registration, similarly, hopefully to how you found this opportunity. And then lastly, I want to give a little bit of time, if you would please, to take a moment and fill out our survey. It's always helpful to have feedback and information about how the programming landed for people, the needs that you have as you're working on, just implementing and figuring out how do we do this, right? How do we do this thing that we know is hard, but we know is so necessary. And so there's that survey, and it would mean the world if you would fill that out, just provide some honest feedback so we can continue growing and making sure our programs are actually meeting the needs of the field, right? Many of us are in the trenches as well with you, supporting schools, doing things like that, but it's always so helpful to have that information. And so Livia's dropping all of that in the chat. Thank you. But what I would love to do is just create some space right now if there are questions, wonderings, additional comments, additional ideas. sometimes 2 hours is kind of a tough spot for a workshop. I feel like after an hour and a half, everyone's kind of like, I'm tired, ready to move on. So I'd love to know, is there something you're still wondering? Any slides I need to go back to, or any questions that you have? I'd love to just create a few minutes here at the end for that.
I just would like to say thank you, Bree. Thank you very much. This was really informative and helpful. So thank you.
Thanks, Janine. I appreciate that. Yeah, if you have all the links you need, if you have the survey, those resources there for you. I know, like I said, we have busy lives, so feel free to sign on out. But I'd love to, just before you leave, if you could just give us, just drop a word in the chat that's describing your feelings, your thoughts, your mood as you're exiting this space, whether that's a commitment, something like that. I'd appreciate just that feedback. And if you want to stay on longer, I'd love to answer any of your questions. Super appreciative of all of you being here today, creating space to share. My hope and heart is always that you feel more connected, ready to hopefully make change in the spaces, because we need you. We need each and every one of you in this conversation. Thank you so much for being here, everyone.